Hey guys, you probably know me from the seasonal minion mega guides. I'm also sometimes occasionally on the D4 subreddit, and I'm like pretty active on the Necromancer one. Um, I'm the Thorn slash minion guy. You might know me as just add sleep on there, or you'll see me as like bacterial on the server. I wanted to make a video and break down the things in the game that I like and I dislike, and maybe some ideas, moving forward to kind of make it a better player experience. Um, and I'm gonna try to condense this down because there's just so much to cover here. I know that this is gonna end up being like at least 30 minutes plus, but maybe in editing it'll be less. But yeah, let's cover some things, go over some things, and kind of just go over how I feel about the game. Um, Starting off, masterworking. I think it's a cool system. I think anytime you give the players the ability to increase the power of their character through a means of like slow progression is good for the game. Um, I would say specifically in this category, right? Like if we're looking at an item, so like we'll look at something like Shroud, for example. If we have Shroud and we don't really care about the stats for a lot of builds, so like I would say like this unique in general is just like a value unique, right? But a lot of the time you're either going to be dumping into max life or all stats. And the current problem that I have with masterworking is that the system doesn't really reward the work you put into it. A lot of it is chance. And so whenever like I'm making a build or I'm talking to people about a build, and there'll be like something that's like, oh, you need like triple crit, max life, and you need to farm a mythic unique until you get like a GA or something. Like someone will throw out a build guide like that. It's so unrealistic for your casual player to ever achieve that. And it's really only for like your sweats who are playing the game like it's a full-time job to realistically go out and do 100 Duriel runs a day and to get this. And like that's fine. I think there's a place for the hyper focused and hyper invested players, the tryhards, to have something to do. I think that's good, but I think we could very easily tune this down a lot and make it more of a system with natural progression. Whether that means being able to reset down one level or, maybe even something where it's, less RNG in some way. I think that would be good to kind of close the gap between those two different people in the player base. Um, Other than that, I like the idea of how it works because it allows you to invest into an item beyond what it already gives you in value. So I think masterworking is a cool system. I just think it's a little too RNG, and the amount of grinding for the amount of reward is too taxing. And it gets to the point of being very discouraging, especially since there's a lot of systems in the game, and I'll go more into that with like loot, but it's a lot of systems in the game where like the ideology to have a healthy economy is to brick items. And if we are already bricking an item per build, when you go to play another character, and let me add something on here because of that. When you go to play another character, you're so beat, you're so worn out from like trying to min max a single meta build that when you go to do the for fun builds, and especially for someone like me who does like a lot of playtesting, it really is demoralizing. I think the system's just too taxing. And if there's a middle ground for that, something to ease the grind in that aspect, because we don't need to make the game specific to you log on for a season and you play one thing. You're doing one build for that season. Like it doesn't need to be that way. Everyone that I know will play like the highest performing build And then there's like 3 other builds or there's other classes that they want to jump into. But they're just so beat from the grind of doing masterworking and min-maxing that they never really want to get to that next step and do that next thing. Unrealistic suggestion, but an idea. If I were going to cater completely to the casual audience, I would say masterworking should be a system where you could masterwork an item's stats completely, so then you remove the RNG factor, and then if you get the bad rolls first, you can keep grinding to get better rolls, and or you're masterworking the character itself. So if you had an item, you could masterwork a slot for a higher initial cost, and then that would allow you to interchange items, and like especially with the armory being introduced to the game, and people like wanting to build swap, I think it would just be, better to extend the gameplay loop for players. Moving on to tempering, I do not like the tempering system. I've never liked the tempering system. I'm super biased here. I think the devs have done a great job in giving us customization. I think there are a lot of things that is like too much customization, and I feel like putting like ×2 multipliers on gear is really harmful for the game. I think there's just too many multipliers in the game in general. But so for example, if I'm looking at like a weapon, you'll have things where like if I want to play a build, right? It's almost essential that it has hit twice or deal double damage. And a really good example of this is like I just played an Affliction build, and I have, like Affliction hits twice, right? I've rolled 5 two-handed swords, like double, triple GA two-handed swords. Every single time I've low rolled this, and it feels terrible. It actively makes me not want to play an already off-meta build, which is discouraging, because like it's already something I'm just doing for fun. And at the end of the day, I think there's a bargaining chip there, like at one point there needs to be a grind, because video games are fun because they're challenging and they introduce difficulty, and figuring out ways to get over that hurdle is a part of what keeps us engaged. So I definitely think there needs to be some form of difficulty to acquire power, but I don't think it needs to be so completely RNG. I've seen suggestions of keeping your last roll. I think that's a pretty good approach. And then, people, like, you get items fairly often. I also wouldn't be mad at a system, and this is like another like unrealistic suggestion. I wouldn't be mad at a system where like this would start out at 32%. So like in this universe, I get to choose what roll it is. It starts out at the lowest roll, and then I have to grind to increase the temper on it. So I'm removing the RNG factor, which like a lot of people are against, right? Because they're like, oh, well, if there's no RNG, then you just get to go in and do whatever build you want. But realistically, people already do that. For example, this season I sold a fast blood aspect, like a perfect one, and I just had all the gold I ever needed to do anything. And I'll talk about trade in that aspect a little bit more. Another thing, though, is that there is a ton of tempers in the game. There's too many tempers in the game, but there isn't enough for all the build paths that a class is able to do, which sort of breaks apart the idea of like discovery and playing something niche. So for example, Affliction has a temper, but Shadow Blight doesn't. And I'm assuming that that's because Shadow Blight's going to be reworked in the near future, which would be really cool. Like, I actually want to talk about that too. But it does hurt anybody who like is trying to make that a build. Another example of this would be like Thorns. Minions are kind of a pain point in that regard, and I could talk about that more in the Minions little segment. But so for example, we have Army of the Dead, which is cool. That's a great temper. I think this is an awesome temper. But But all of this, like, we don't really need three of them. I get the idea of like you're investing into one thing, but like warriors do so little damage. They're worse than every basic skill in the game. They're worse than every skill in the game. They're worse than crackling energy. You're never scaling these. The only way you're scaling warriors is through men down, and none of these work on the stacks. So if there is a change coming for it, I would say these could stay, and like having like that customization would be super awesome. If there isn't one coming, I would say just make all the minions have a hit twice. You know, let people play whatever they want. Add a different temper into this, augment, and I don't know. I mean, it's just like a quality of life thing. If you do like want to play a dedicated minion build, which will never really push pit besides mages and like Fel, Gluttony, Golem, this temper is just basically here for you to brick items. Like, this is all this is here for. No one can use this. So I would say at the least change this to something else if the other two stay, because I do like the idea of like investing into a specific thing. But yeah, that's just sort of my viewpoint on tempering. Once again, like masterworking, it's a little too RNG, and it starts to discourage people the longer they play. And I think now that we're a couple seasons into having it, it's really starting to hurt your like dedicated player base that starts a new season and they're just like, oh well, I can't do the tempering grind again. I can't do the masterworking grind again. Like, especially for your solo self-found players. Normally I'm solo self-found and don't interact with trading because I like to look at the game from that lens. But yeah, I think they're both really creative systems. And I think it's great that we're improving the value of items and we're able to really specialize our builds. I just think they need a little bit of a touch-up, a little quality of life. This one's pretty quick and easy. It's kind of a hard critique. Quality assurance needs a little more attention. I know there's so much going on all the time, and the devs are working tirelessly. Like, I'm certain of it. Like, you can see them in the campfire chat, like, it looks like these guys are putting in the hours. I just think that I would rather have something work from a previous season than to add in a new thing for a future season and then risk it not working. I know some other content creators have talked about this specifically, and I agree with them that it's really disheartening when someone, like, if you've ever seen one of my minion guides for the season, almost half the posts are people asking me if something will work. And if I know from the PTR, if when something goes live, if it's realistic for them to play it. I think this really hit home this season with minions. I mean, I even put a note that, like, told people not even to try Thorns because it's, like, not working at all. And that's something that I, like, want to talk about a little bit later, too, but I don't know. I think I would rather have something come out and, not get changed. Like, you put it on the back burner for, like, maybe it's a patch that comes in between the launch and the mid-season. You give it a little more time. I'm fine with that. I think if it's not ready, like, let's not ship it. But yeah, it just needs a little bit more, because I do think it hurts. It hurts players who, especially the casual players who get to the end game and they have it in their mind. They have like a build from the previous season and they're like, oh my gosh, like, I really love this playstyle. And then they get there and it's like, I can't do it, And then they'll end up not playing the rest of the season, or they'll abandon the class and move on to something else, which is, fine if they find something else to play. But the abandoning the season is bad for the game. End game balance. This is kind of a big one. I don't know what the vision the devs have is for the game. I think overall, I like the direction we're going. I have some problems though. So I don't like 150 being the end all be all, because we're sort of doing the thing we did in Diablo 3 where we're having like rat runs where it's like, I want to play this thing, but I also need Paragon to do X thing. So if the class that I want to play cannot do pit 150 on the season launch, I'm going to play this other thing first, and then I'm going to play my class. Which, like, not everyone does this, you know, but it just depends on the power of the class, like how many tiers down it is from something else. Because there really is, for your hardcore players, it is a really, like, not hardcore, but your serious, like, invested players, there is a time imperative, you know? You have a lot of content creators who are like, I need to do, like, X number of build videos. I need to cover this amount of content. And the faster that they do it, the more, you know, like, there's more incentive for it. But also for, like, your really try-hard players who are like, I really want to push, like, we'll use Sorceress, for example. I really want to push Sork this season. But, like, they don't have, like, a good, easy starting endgame build. They'll just go for whatever's meta. A lot of people will do that. And I don't think that's good for the game. I think pits, maybe the XP needs to fall off at like 110. And I don't mean nerf it. I just mean I think you should normalize it around 110. I think 110 is actually a really good balance point because that's the area where you are 100% chance to upgrade a glyph to level 100. And I don't really care if builds go above that. Like, that's fine. And there's going to be things we don't catch, right? But I do think, along with, like, the Q&A portion, there needs to be some serious hammering down on game-breaking issues, exploits, and bugs. Because we end up in a problem where, like, you have something that is overperforming, and then if you were to play something else with that person, they're invalidating the gameplay loop. Like, all the content is just, they're not really doing anything. It was like Necro before we had, like, any mobility, where you go to, like, join 4 people to go do, like, a nightmare dungeon or something, and they're just flying around the map, one-shotting the screen, and it didn't even matter whether or not you could do it. It just mattered to the fact that, like, you didn't really get to do anything. You were just leeching the entire time, unintentionally. So I think there needs to be balance in the sense of, like, if this is a multiplayer experience, we need to allow everyone to feel like they're participating, because it does get really boring if you don't feel like you have any agency with your party. I think it isn't. I think right now the intention. So for, like, the first point, I think the intention's like pit 120 for a lot of builds. That feels about right for everything that's seeing play, and I think that's good. You know, like, pit 120 is great for a balance standpoint. For what will make us happy, I think people just feeling like they get to participate, you know? And yeah, the goal would just be, you know, working around balance. The game's all numbers, and a lot of stuff, like, I know GMS and theory crafters and build makers and, you know, all the people who like to find the goofy and niche things in the game. We do stuff like this, you know? This is a really basic damage calculator, and it doesn't take everything into account. You know, most of the time you have like 100% crit, and like every time if you're going to overpower, you're always going to overpower. But this essentially can tell me what the top end of a build would be if all the stars align and everything is set up properly, right? So, like, for example, Affliction, this is like very, very close to the values that I see in the game. And if I tweak this, I've actually been able to pinpoint a build down to get the same results I get on a test dummy that I get on a sheet. So I think in terms of balance, if we were going to say that a build should, like, max out in perfect gear at a set point, just using damage calculators, we can get close within a couple pit tiers. The gameplay loop. I think the gameplay loop is pretty fun. Um, Leveling, I think, is too short. There's no incentive for really anything besides like find 3 other people, do whatever that seasonal thing is most advantageous. Um, I think that's a good and a bad thing. The good thing about that is that you are putting people grouped together in the same content. The bad thing about that is not everyone wants to do that. Um, Especially with the casual couch co-op experience. Not everyone just wants to do what's the most efficient. There are like really fun things to do in the game. You have a lot of really amazing quests. You have a lot of like really interesting world building and like open world to explore. Um, there's so many wonderful things about the game to be invested in and to explore that I do feel like pinpointing everything down to being like, oh, well, rushing strongholds is the best thing after you hit like level 42 or 47, and then you have like um, doing the new tide based activity is the best thing. I Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We just need to divvy it up a little bit, maybe make people feel a little more busy by making more things of equal value for leveling, both on Eternal and Seasonal. Nightmare Dungeons is kind of goofy because they don't really have value, and this kind of comes back to the whole, like, let's normalize experience gains. I think if you're in World Tier 4 and you're doing Nightmare Dungeons, you should be getting near the same experience gain as if you're running, like, higher pits. And I know a lot of hardcore people are going to be like, oh, well, that's not the same because, it's harder to do this. And it's like, well, playing a meta build isn't necessarily harder. And I don't think punishing people for wanting to play what they find is fun is good for the gameplay loop. So I think normalizing Nightmare Dungeons to have more value than they currently do is a good thing. They also are just kind of obdicite farms, and there's enough of them that it doesn't really always feel repetitive, but you'll get enough of the same sigil that it does feel repetitive. I do really, really like what you did with the root holds. I think if you made that like a permanent mechanic into Nightmare Dungeons and you added some randomness and higher reward based on changing the difficulty of the content, it would do so much for the game. And it would be a tragedy to not implement that into the base game. I think that is like such a cool mechanic, and like you guys knocked it out of the park with that. I've kind of already talked about pits. I don't really think I need to cover more on that subject. I think normalizing the XP, balancing it so group content matters and participation feels good. Yeah, that's about it. With tides, I like the new witch tides. You got to keep the ravens. I mean, I don't know. It's so brutal teleporting every like. Sometimes it'll be every 2 events you do, you're teleporting to the tree. If we don't keep the ravens, increase the cap of things you can do so you can accumulate more chests. I even think like turn the tree into a rep thing. If like same with the mercenaries, just like you just accumulate stacks and stacks of it, because at the end of the day it's not incentivizing anything special there. A lot of people will save their whisper caches anyways to level characters. I do think it could be bad in the sense of like your casual player might not know to interact with it after a certain point, but like a quick little tutorial sort of fixes that. Overall, I do like the tides. It made whispers a heck of a lot more interesting, and I don't really want it to go away. Because I don't want to grind whispers if you change it. And this is sort of the problem. This is like the power creep of like quality of life changes. If you add quality of life to the game, taking it away feels terrible. And I think there's enough room to find a middle ground there, but let's not like completely remove everything about it. But yeah, it's sort of my opinion on that. World bosses do not feel impactful. They don't feel challenging. They feel like bullet sponges right now. The loot is unexciting for something that is on a cooldown. I know you guys don't want to like, you don't want to be too much like WoW, but like, come on, like you guys own the IP for one of the most successful like RPG games to ever exist. Having like time gated content isn't always a bad thing, so long as it's not the only way to get something. So I would say improve the quality of world bosses, make them harder, make people have to dodge the mechanics, even if they're like super geared to the teeth. Make them interesting. And your casual players aren't really jumping straight into World Tier 4 anyways. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I know there will be people who are like, oh, this content's too hard. This is too difficult. And in which case it's like, well, go down a couple world tiers, dude. Like, you don't need to be... You can't do it. You know, it's like Dark Souls. You need to learn something. What's wrong here? Something I should add to this is the Uber bosses. Uber bosses are in a terrible place. I don't like the boss mat grind. I do not like... I think this season I spent 10 hours running Duriel, and only Duriel. Because it was just the best way to get mythics. And I got all the mythics that I needed in that time frame, and then I never went back to that content. And I don't think any content that you do a set amount of time and then you never interact with is a good endgame loop. I think the boss fights are really cool. They die way too quickly. You don't have to worry about the mechanics. Sort of the same thing as world bosses. I mean, they need to be harder. The reward needs to be better. And I don't really like the mythic grind, but I'll add that to the list. Citadel is the coolest thing you have done to date for the end game, in my opinion. I think it is so cool that you guys added like an actual dungeon to the game with unique boss mechanics. And you know what? To expand on that, the dungeons you added to in Vessel of Hatred to Nahantu are amazing. The strongholds you guys added are amazing. The level of detail and the amount of investment that you've put into that is fantastic. And I would love to see more Citadel content, especially if we start balancing the game for group play. I think that is so great. And it's so fun, you know, whether you're playing with randoms or your friends, having something that is difficult that you overcome with other people is so rewarding. So all I can say on Citadel right now is that the loot feels a little uninspired. It's more of like a cosmetic grind than anything else. Maybe up it a little bit. Same thing with like the world bosses, making it like a time, like maybe a weekly reward. Doesn't have to be the only way to get something, but it could be something where like, if you are invested into the season and you want to log on every week and you want to get your Resplendent Spark or something from Citadel, or like guaranteed ancestral drops, sure, why not? You know what I mean? Like, get people to keep playing. The game's great. Let's keep people invested. I think this last point was kind of covered by everything else, so I don't really want to cover it. Loot filters. Yeah. This one's going to be pretty much a hard critique, because I'm super biased here. I'm a hardcore, like, Diablo 1, Diablo 2, Diablo 3 fan. Jumping into Diablo 4, I've always had my critiques of the system. I don't want to approach this without that disclaimer, because I don't want people to think that I'm just, like, trashing on the game. I just have a different viewpoint of, like, what I think should be the systems in place. So yeah, let's dive into it. Ancestrals, I feel like, and people are going to say, you know, like, oh, hey man, you're like gating the game to become just drastically easier. And to some extent, yes. Another thing of it is loot fatigue. I think at some point we need to get rid of non-ancestral items in our loot pool. And I think that kind of comes with like you're doing content at a level that you're never going to use a 750 item anymore, right? So it's not so much about making the game easier. You could keep the same drop rates. Just stop making me sift through 750 gear. I don't care if I don't get it anymore. I don't even care if I don't get the mats anymore for non-ancestral gear. I just don't want it to like be sent automatically to my stash and for me to like be constantly picking it up and dealing with it. It's just it's loot fatigue. Um we don't have to make the game easier. Let's improve the quality of life on that, you know? Mythics. I like the mythic crafting system. I don't like the way we're supposed to get mythics. It's it's just grind. It's just straight grind. Which is fine if the content was more engaging, but it is literal watching paint dry grind. Um, I know that's a harsh critique, but if anyone else has done a day of just 6 hours of Duriel, where you farm Duriel, you sell all the items because you don't need the materials, and then you use the gold from selling the items to buy more Duriel mats so that you can keep running Duriel because the only thing you want is Resplendent Sparks, and you don't even care about what mythics drop anymore unless they're GA, it is so mind numbing. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think other people will agree with me here. I know that is like a really hard critique of the system, but that's how I feel. Um, Amulets need to change. The way that we itemize amulets need to change, and I think this kind of goes into like itemization in general. That's my cat. Um, I don't like that for a lot of builds. The best thing is a like int 2 passive or like main stat 2 passive amulet, or it'll be like a 3 passive amulet, or it's unique and you never grind for it and you just buy like a cheap one off of like one of the mini trade sites. Um, I think we need to change the way that stats roll on an amulet and we lower the power that an amulet brings across the board. I think it is like hands down one of the strongest pieces in the game, but it's also one of the hardest things to grind for um unless you get into trading. And I feel like that's fine, but it is another like if you're lucky, you never interact with it again, and if you're unlucky, you'll spend the entire season looking for something. And for the people who either buy their way into it or they get lucky, your gameplay loop is ended, and there's no like incentive to keep going on. And that sort of goes back into the whole like if there are other builds for people to play and there's other classes for people to play and there's more things for them to do for them to find enjoyment out of a season once they're done with a character, I don't think it's bad for people to be able to reach the point that they're done with a character earlier if we're also encouraging people to interact with the armory and other characters in other builds. But yeah, I think we need to change amulets to being like a passive role, um, and then like a utility and an offensive or something. And, you know, like at least in that sense, maybe even changing the way we re-roll stats on gear. And this really kind of goes into like a whole other rant, but I don't really want to get too much into that until I get down another section. But yeah, they just need to change a little bit. It's either you buy it or you don't, you know, you get lucky. This we've already covered. This is done. There's too much, and I'm willing to give up mats to not interact with it. Like this is loot fatigue. Trading. Trading is a huge issue for me because the solo self-found portion of the game is like essentially forgotten because trading exists. And it's sort of the same mindset of like if we could have it this way, it'd be great, but we don't because there are other systems in place. Um, So like sites like Diablo Trade and Tradery and things like that, where you can go on, you can find items that you need for your build. I would rather have an auction house. I'd rather have a mail system. Another thing about trading that really frustrates me is having to add people by their battle tag and not being able to invite them to party with like a /I. Like I should be able to type like, or like that should be it. Like I should just be able to do /I or like /invite or like /W or /whisper, and I should be able to like paste someone's battle their BattleNet tag into the game, and I should just be able to interact with them. I do not like playing sorting through my friends list. Like the mini game of sorting through my friends list feels so terrible. Um, I think there needs to be a better system in place for this, and I don't know how hard that is to implement. But I feel like if we're not going to get a mail system and we're not going to get an auction house, at least give us these tools. I feel like they're pretty easy additions. Um, and I think they would do a lot for quality of life involving trading, because I don't see trading going anywhere. I think it's a good and bad thing for the game. And to get more into that aspect of it, I feel like trading exists either for the people who are really pushing the end game and are trying to find the items that they're never going to find solo self-found in a season, or it exists for the people who are abusing third-party means or RMT to completely invalidate the game for themselves and kill the gameplay loop. I know there's a big like ethical discussion to be had where like, oh, I work 60 hours a week and I just want to come home and I just want to blast through demons. But then the question is, why is the game only interesting to you when you are the best you can ever be? Why? And this kind of goes back to the gameplay loop, like things being more interactive, having people to play with, socialization, being a bigger part of the game. Why exactly are we doing that? You know what I mean? But yeah, like I think trading is good for the game in a lot of ways, but I also think it's bad for the game because it does things like it discourages changing the way that loot functions, because the assumption is that someone is going to trade to get the items they need rather than play the game to get the items they need. And because of the way that like masterworking, amulets, ancestrals all work, tempering works, and like the ability to brick items, a lot of your end game progression is based on chance and you playing a marketing simulator. And if we're gonna keep that marketing simulator, let's move it into the game. Like let's move it away from like third-party online sites that are, really prioritizing our clicks and ad views, into us not being broken from the immersion of the game that we enjoy and being able to just continue in the gameplay loop. Which also like interacting with people at a more personal level, I feel like is better for the game, because you might meet people through trading in game that you then go on to do content with. And that sort of also plays into like socialization and finding group content that matters and balancing around that. Stash space. We just need to increase it. Like at the end of the day, I don't know what's going on. I think it's pretty good if you have one character and you're filling up like every armory tab. But then once again, like because the game is so trade reliant for like pushing the end game, there isn't enough space for you to keep all the items that you want to sell, plus all the items that you need for your different builds. Another thing is like runes. You need to increase the rune tab so that you can fit all the different rune types in the game, at least on your character, because that frees up stash space. Nightmare sigils is another thing where like they need to stack or something. Like, I don't know, put them in the codex. There's no trading them. I feel like anything that you can't trade should not sit in your character's inventory in any way. And you shouldn't be putting things of value into your stash space, like tributes are a good example, because you're afraid of like salvaging all of them, which I've done and feels so terrible. I just think, like we need a little more quality of life when it comes to the whole inventory Tetris and some way to increase space. Like, I'd be willing to buy stash tabs. And I don't think, like, if you guys added that to the shop, I'm not going to consider that predatory at all. If it's some type of, like, tax on the server or something like that, and I know a lot of people are going to come at me and be like, hey, like, you shouldn't be encouraging Blizzard to do this, but I don't care. I just want more stash space, and other games do it. If that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. I would rather have it. To get to the last subject, which is where like I'm a really heavy D2, D3 player transplanted into D4. I don't think resistances matter enough, and I don't think the end game matters enough, and I think it invalidates so many items. This is a good example. Tassets is a good example. Rakanoths is a good example. Tyrells is a good example now that like Shroud is just best in slot for basically everybody. Heart of Selig is a really good example. These items don't matter. These items are nothing burgers in the game right now. There's a lot of other uniques. This video is already too long. I can't get into it. But this is just a spark. This is all this is to anybody. There's no one who uses this. And part of like balancing the pit, I think pit should just be harder to survive. And I think there should be a trade-off in builds where you're like, okay, well, I have to replace Shroud with Tyrells, or I have to replace my pants with Tassets, or I need like Melted Heart, and this could like solve a lot of like, because you're taking your amulet and you're losing so much power there, this should maybe be stronger. I also think we could maybe cut down on the multipliers on like defensive and utility slots to kind of just bring the power down in the game, because I don't know what the next stat squish looks like, but I would rather solving power with itemization, I think is a better solution than just being like, oh well, the monster damage reduction is going from like 85 to 93 or something. But yeah, that's sort of my mindset on it. I do also feel like uniques sort of invalidate the grind for items. Like if I were to look at this, it's not hard to find defensive items, really. But at the same time, there's so many uniques on a build, and it creates a lot of unused aspects. I think that's like another portion that I should talk about with loot. There's a lot of aspects in the game that just don't have a purpose because they've either been power crept out of the game, or they're defensive and they've been like, I don't know what the word I would use for that, defense crept out of the game, where you just don't need them. And that sort of feels bad. So, yeah, I think itemization needs to change a little bit. This is more a personal opinion. I know there's a lot of people who really like the way itemization is going. I really like the way that you guys have done it so far. I think it's really interesting that we have so many things. I just don't want to see all of these uniques, Mother's Embrace, Ring of Sacrilegious Soul, God Slayers, Crown Illusion. It just, there's all these uniques that are like wonderful uniques that are so cool to interact with, but they're just worse, Like, what am I think Blight's the only build I've seen this season that uses Lucians over Air Perdition. Once this exists, and that's sort of the thing about itemization, once you power creep the game and you create something that is better than other options, and it is accessible in a realistic amount of time to find, it then becomes the only option. And I think that is bad. I think items need to be balanced around being useful for at least some things, some builds. And I don't think there should be a one set best option for every build in the game. And that's sort of the same thing with Shroud and Air right now. Moving on to the Necromancer. Wonderful job on build diversity. There are so many builds that we can play this season Um, all of our core skills are fantastic. They're not all at the same power level. That's fine. You guys did a lot of tweaking. I don't know. You guys are knocking it out of the park with build diversity. The amount of things that you're able to play, the fact that I could play Affliction as a speed farming build for Torment 4 was super cool. And I hope to see more of that in future seasons. Minions. I don't want to talk about the bugs. Obviously, they're bugged right now. There's a fix coming in 2.12. I haven't tested any of it. I don't know. There's not like a PTR for me to look at that sort of thing. So for the non-bugged issues with minions, we still don't have a way to command them. And there is no playing them besides two things, which is Fel Gluttony and Ring 'em and Down. These are the only two realistic ways to play them in the endgame. And I get having, like, build-defining aspects, build-defining uniques. Like, I talk about it fairly often, and, you know, I tell people, you know, like, that they're in place to elevate a build from something that is very niche and, like, a Torment 4 viable thing to, like, a high-end Pit viable thing. I think minions need to be more than that, though. I think a lot of builds need to be more than that. A couple examples of this are, like, all of our builds where you have, like, Deathless Visage, Crew's Embrace, Death Speaker's Pendant, Mordecrux. These are not empowering the skills themselves. They are what's doing damage. X falls for every class. And the problem that I have with this, for those who are familiar with Diablo 3, those who are not, we'll go look at it real quick. This item was introduced into Diablo 3, or like had been there from like the start. I can't remember. Back in the days when like Scorn was trading on like the Real Money Auction House. It's been so long. This item and the Mantle Ring were plagued because they did a set amount of damage and there was no way to scale them in some seasons, and in some seasons they were broken. So for anyone who remembers like Arcane Meteor Wizard, it was sort of that same problem where like you had certain builds like Archon that could just have infinite stacks, and all of a sudden these items were just hitting for trillions of damage, and they were so good. Like, they were just so fantastic, and it was totally reliant on the season, whether or not they were playable or not playable. And I feel like with Diablo 4, we run into that same issue. Where you have these items that are build-enabling uniques, but they have flat damage on them. In some seasons, they're going to be exceptionally good, and in other seasons, the builds are going to be unplayable. And it's not like Blood Surge is unplayable this season, but no one's using Death Speaker's Pendant because it's just objectively worse. So I feel like if we're going to have uniques in the game, we need to focus on the uniques themselves and powering the skills. And this also makes it a lot easier to balance skills. So like, if Crew's Embrace cast a mini Blood Surge Nova instead of just casting a mini Nova of flat damage, you would balance Blood Surge, the skill itself, if it was under or overperforming, rather than you would having like that extra hula hoop to jump through, where you're then balancing all of these items, and every time you add a new one, it's a new item to balance, right? You're no longer balancing around the skill tree. You're balancing around all these items. And, you know, it gets to the point that there is just so many things in the game that it's hard to get to each and every one of them, you know? And the game's constantly evolving and becoming more complex, and, you know, I think that's so great. But let's simplify those aspects down a little bit. Let's make minions matter. Let's make the skills that are being used matter. And let's empower those and balance those so that we have less of that happening season to season. Because it's fine if something is stuck at the same power level, but it's bad if we have like if we just decide for next season that 150 is no longer the new cap and you want to raise the cap up to like pit 200 because too many builds are doing it, you then have to go back and balance the skills and these items. And then, you know, you also have the problem of like someone wants to play like Ebon Piercer Blight build. Ebon Piercer does all the damage. Ring of Mendeln does all the damage. That's not good for the game. Because when you have like ranks to the skill itself on the item, it's a dead stat if the item itself is doing all the damage. And then if we change that approach to being based on the skill, then all the stats that are on that item actually feel good. I don't know. I've gone too much in the weeds with this. I just feel overall we can improve the value of the skills themselves. And like, I mean, there's, you know, before chance for Blight to hit twice worked on the passive, that was also dead stat. So you had like unique. That was the only way for the build to be in the end game. That had 2 dead stats on it. I don't know. You get what I'm saying. We'll move on from that. Yeah, so minions just need like, they need some quality of life updates. They need like the same attack speed scaling as skills, 3 attacks per second. Warriors definitely need higher skill damage. We need a way to empower them rather than placing all of their usefulness around uniques or an aspect. Same deal. Blighted Corpse Explosion and Plagued Corpse Explosion. I'm going to try to make this quick. Blighted Corpse Explosion lives on the ground. We're fearing monsters out of it. It feels terrible. If we could maybe make it so that when a monster walks through the puddle, the dot then lives on the monster and could refresh and increase the value of that dot on a monster based on applications, that would be much better. Because like with everything in our kit, the pain of trying to focus monsters to sit in our pools of direct damage feels terrible. And every other class has it. You know, like Barbarian has bleeds, Spiritborn and Rogue have poisons, Druids have poison. Just everyone, Sorks have burning damage. I mean, everyone else, their dots get to live on the target, and like their damage, their DPS uptime is like fantastic because of it. I just kind of want to see that for Necro, you know, and that would also make things easier to be more viable, like Desecrated Ground, which is just not useful at all right now. The other thing that I really want to say about this is that there is almost never a reason to go this route because it doesn't scale. You just end up with bonus skill points, right? Because we have like Universal, but like it doesn't benefit from Reapers. It's not a darkness skill, so no terror or gloom. It's not a blood skill. It's not a bone skill. And on a topic I'll talk about later, it needs, I mean, realistically, make it a blood skill if we're not going to deal with overpower. It just needs to have, because this would be the most viable way to play Corpse Explosion, honestly, if it had scaling. But it just doesn't. So, yeah, I don't know. That just needs a change. There's nothing really to talk about with Blood Spear besides the fact that I wanted to bring up the point, which is sort of the same thing with Plague Corpse Explosion and everything else. It's bad when Bone Spirit was our best build to play every single season up to this season, like when we discovered it was good. Thank you, Sarok. And now no one plays it. I don't think the answer to all of our direct damage and bone skills should be give it the blood tag. I also do not think all of our blood skills getting, like, just give it the darkness tag. I don't think just tacking on multipliers. It's good in the sense that it increases the ability for it to push. It's bad in the sense that it's just sort of removing the identity of a build in a playstyle. Everything sort of feels the same. You're sort of always building the same character. And then you also just asking the same question every season, can it overpower? And if it can't overpower, I'm not going to play it because it's not going to be good. And I'll get into overpower later, but basic skills. Decompose needs to be changed. I like the idea that it could be a damage over time thing. It's not good. And everything else is better than it. Hemorrhage and like most of the blood skills, you just need a way to interact, like to be able to pick up blood orbs easier. Whether that's like the Diablo 3 like pickup radius, or an aspect or a unique. I had previously suggested that Mordecrux, the skeletons, would like go and pick up blood orbs. It's just kind of like super random. It could be even like a skill in the tree, like every time you overpower, you pick up close blood orbs or something. I don't know. Might be a fix for that. This is really cool, and the Bone Spirit one is really cool to like synergize with that. Not playable. I mean, it is, but it's like really bad. Reap also, like, these just need a buff in some aspect. You don't have enough aspects to play them really. I'm like getting to the end of my patience talking about all this. Ossified Essence, Shadowblight, and Kalen's. Kalen's is only taken because it's better than Affliction. We don't really struggle to get attack speed cap on minions anymore. Ossified Essence needs to just be like... Bone skills need to matter, I think. Whether that means nerfing Rathmas to make this a viable pickup, which I don't think anybody wants. And I'm probably going to have people like screaming at me for saying that. But I think at least doubling this to 1%, and this could even be core skills, you know, that might be fun. Maybe more skills could scale with max essence. Maybe it just has skills, you know, scale with max essence. There, you know, for builds that don't overpower, there needs to be something that competes. Shadowblight, I think you guys are reworking this. You didn't give us a temper. It was the damage was updated, but it's not. I mean, you just play Affliction. There's no reason to play this. I personally want this to be like some type of like dot empowerment, darkness skill empowerment. I had previously suggested that the decay augmentation, seasonal witch power, could be like, this could essentially be that. So then it would be something like every 8th time they take shadow damage from you, on that 8th time they take a portion of whatever darkness damage you deal, which then would turn into like a dot or something. The shadow damage over time thing is sort of the problem, because it's like we're constantly splitting the identity of what this wants to be. If this was crit damage, it would be so much better. It would be a million times better. If shadow damage over time and darkness damage became the same thing, then maybe you could go the route where like this would also be good for Blight and Sever and Shadow Blood Wave and Shadow like Bone Storm. I don't know. I don't know what your guys' plans are for this. It just needs to change because it's just a dead key passive. And the only thing I really wanted to say about Kalen's is it's generic. It's good. Like, but if you ever give us an ability to overpower our minions, this is just better. Like, this will be like Shadow Blight, and we'll just never take it again. And it's the same thing. If you guys give a quality of life update to Ossified Essence, and you give us more ways to overpower, these 3 key passives essentially don't exist in the game anymore, and there's no reason to ever use them. So that's just like my 2 cents. I also feel like you could let this stack up to 45 times increased damage for like, I don't know how that would work, but 15 times damage is weak compared to these two. And like, if we're being realistic, the only reason you take this is because you're not stacking max essence because it's too hard to fit into your gear and you can't overpower. And you're not playing minions. So Affliction in itself, I feel like is such a cool mechanic in the game and very fun. I also feel like I mean, I'll get into that later. I don't need to go on that now. I've already been talking for an hour. Blood Wave. It just needs to be. It needs to be nerfed. It's too strong. It needs to be bug fixed. It needs to be nerfed. I mean, people are like, "Oh, what does balance matter?" But this kind of goes back to the whole group play thing. You just have a build that completely invalidates the game and the gameplay loop. So, it just needs to be fixed. Bone Storm is just... It's bad because of this. Shields giving 80% main hand weapon damage is bad. This needs to be like a focus. Necros are the only people who can use shields. I feel like this is easy enough to balance. You're only really risking breaking, I don't know, Bone Storm. There's like no other build besides Thorns that uses lidless or a shield in general. If you guys do go the route of like increasing the amount of defense that you need for a build to perform, I still think this needs to be 100%. Because people will just choose to do damage. Yeah. Also, I mean, I don't really want to go too much into that, but when we have like something like this, right, and then we have a unique like lidless, where it, you know, your golem also gets Bone Storm. The sacrifice bonuses, it's like I'm always going to take the sacrifice bonus. The sacrifice bonuses have just been a pain. Like on the topic of minions, we'll jump back for a second. Sacrifice bonuses have always just been a pain because you're choosing power over utility, and power always wins in the end game. So, personally, I think these should just be passive effects, and then if you don't have an army up, you get the bonuses from Memento Mori and Sacrificial Aspect. That's my personal take, but that's because I play minions every season. But yeah, it just feels bad. Army of the Dead is... There are a couple things I would change with this. One, when you recast it, if it's not, like, if you get a low enough cooldown, which is possible, and you recast it, it increases the duration, but it doesn't cast a new version of Army of the Dead. So if you recast it before it's done, it's before the 7-second duration, it just loses you skeletons, right? And then that's also a problem with like the Hemet Brawlers aspect, because the duration will end, but the skeletons will still be running to a target, and they'll lose the multiplier because the duration of the ultimate is ended. So that sort of just needs a quality of life increase update. I also think this should be summon damage. I think the mage and golem mastery, I guess, is fine. These are both just objectively worse, and I don't like the idea of just giving everything damage reduction and giving everything a barrier and giving everything, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think ultimate should be ultimate, but leaving behind a corpse, now that we have so much lucky hit for hewed flesh, feels less impactful. And there's very few builds that are going to use enough corpses to ever utilize this in a meaningful way. As far as Army of the, like, Supreme Army of the Dead, I don't know. I feel like if you're taking this, you should be taking this because it's, like, a huge boon to your army or something. And I really, really like this skill. It is so thematic, and it fits the class fantasy so well. Yeah, it just needs an update in that regard. I guess I'll cover Paragon. This is already an hour. With Overpower, I don't think every build should just be able to overpower every time it casts. Because, like, right now, you have a non-blood skill, which is Bone Spear, that can overpower every cast, and it doesn't need Max Essence and Bloodlord's Talisman, and it doesn't need runes, and it's like, why the heck am I playing Bloodlance in Blood Surge if I can just do this? why the heck am I making this stat investment on Bone Spirit with the Essence requirement and Bloodlord's Talisman when I can just do this? I don't think that's good for the game. I also don't think that stacking defensive stats on top of offensive stats, right? So then I can just go like, oh, hey, I'm going to take Intelligence. I'm going to take Max Life. And I'm also going to take, like attack speed or critical strike damage or, overpower damage. And it's like, okay, so every other build in the game that doesn't overpower doesn't get this. Every build in the game that can overpower, they get 3 stats that are offensive on a piece of gear. And it's just too much. I think a couple things on overpower, I think either needs to be separate from crit, so that something that overpowers cannot crit, and you just make overpower a really high alpha hit that you build up to. I don't know. I don't see the point in having bone skills if the end goal is for everything to overpower and we're taking Rathmas on everything anyways. It just feels like we're erasing the identity of like a third of the Necromancer's class. And this is kind of true for every build in the game. Like overpower, you have more stats. You just have more stats. You have more additive. You have more multipliers. You have better multipliers. It's just better. Overpower is just better. And I don't think this should be the end-all be-all. And I don't think this should be the answer to every endgame build. I don't think every endgame build and every viable build should ask the question, can it overpower? Yeah, I don't know. I think that pretty much covers it. As far as Paragon goes, I think there are some issues. Cult Leader, obviously, we have some things that are like minion max life and armor and resistance to all elements. These are dead stats. The only time any of these matter is for Thorns, where you would take armor for your Golem, and that's only in the Golem variation of Thorns. If you're playing Defender Thorns, you don't care about this. So these are this whole node is this node, and this node actually are, they don't exist. There's no point in investing in them for like 99% of the class and minions in general. Everything else here is pretty much fine. I just wanted to bring that up. Another thing is like the mage and the warrior glyph. So like I have additive damage, and then I have resist all, which does nothing because my minions get 100% of my resist all, and if I'm not resist capped, they're not resist capped, and then I'm dying and they're dying. So that's a dead stat. I mean, just like clear cut, it's a dead stat. And it's also a thing where like this is specialized damage. And I get the idea of like, oh, hey, I want to be able to like specialize into like, oh, I want my mages to be good. But this isn't objectively a larger bonus than just doing something like, I don't know, control. Because this is damage, additive damage, a multiplier, and another multiplier. And it's not even like drastically less additive damage than mage would be. It's just a better option. I'm just choosing not to take a dead stat. And it's the same thing with warrior, only warrior is worse because there isn't a build in the game that will ever use warrior. It doesn't scale with Army of the Dead. It doesn't scale with skirmishers, because skirmishers deal like 18% skill damage. So there's no point. And then like the armor bonus is worse than a multiplier. So even if I were to take something like Amplify and I get like 10% or something like that, it's better. It's still better than warrior, even on like a Thorns Golem build. So just mage and warrior need to be changed. Yeah. Flesh Eater. This needs to update when you raise another corpse. It's tedious, and the downtime on it makes it not as valuable as other multipliers. Scent of Death is just weak. It's just weak. You basically always have corpses. So it's just a damage reduction, which people don't want to take. And once again, it sort of just plays into the fact that, like, this is so strong. It's 1.5 times damage, and, like, every time we're playing any build that can overpower, we're also generating blood orbs, so everyone's going to take, corpse tendrils for that. And you also have bloodbath. Every time you overpower, you deal more damage. And then you have things like dominate, where, my gosh, you know what I mean? Like, insane additive damage, a better multiplier, and an insane legendary bonus multiplier. And the idea is that it's hard to overpower, but it's not. So this is just, strictly speaking, better than every other glyph, which just plays more into the, can it overpower? And if it can't, then I'm not playing it. I also think that, like, Bone Graft needs to be buffed. And, like, there should be some identity and fantasy for people to play a bone build in the game that doesn't overpower. Could also change Wither so that this doesn't cap before 2000. I mean, if you guys just want to, like, shimmy some math in there and make it scale at, like, 50 intelligence, or make it scale the remainder, I don't know. It just feels bad that it's not a whole number. It's probably just me being weird. Hulking's fine. It's a dead board if we don't take Golem, and, like, once again, like, on a lot of minion builds, we're sacrificing the Golem for crit damage because it's just strictly better. And I would really like to have more reasons to run Golem, because I can actually control it, and it does so much damage, and it's just so thematically cool. Frailty's like a perfect board. I love Frailty. I think it's, like, such a good multiplier. It's too good. Compared to everything else, it's too good. It's sort of the same issue where it's just too good of a board. Yeah. A little over an hour into this. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that, like, I would cover. Yeah, without getting into too many details, I think, that pretty much sums it up. I guess the last thing I would say is Blood Mist needs to be able to do damage, because it would be such a cool build if Infinimist came back as, like, an overpower blood skill. And then Iron Maiden just isn't very good. It doesn't have a lucky hit chance, it can't crit, it can't overpower. It does damage, but it's not worth investing in. It's just there to proc Affliction and to give us essence and healing. And then, like, on this, if you were going to make this a thing, which I don't think you will, this needs to work on bosses and elites if there's only one enemy nearby. I guess the last little thing I'll throw in here, because, I'm so passionate about Thorns. We don't have any way to really invest into Thorns. So, like, if you look at, like, Barbarian, right? They have, like, Tough as Nails and Outburst, where they have, like, a scaling way through max life to get more Thorns. They also have, like, a key passive for Thorns, right? Where they can, like, apply their Thorns in AoE. Spiritborn's the same way. I don't know what route Thorns is going in, and I know minions are supposed to be, like, the AoE way that Necromancer applies Thorns, but, like, our taunts stagger bosses to a crazy amount, and they just cause, like, the taunt is bad for us because, yes, they'll try to, well, bosses don't because they can't be taunted. They'll try to attack our minions like normal mobs will, but it's not good Thorns application. And when a boss is staggered, like, you don't deal any damage. So I would like, I know I've suggested it, but I would like some way for Necromancer to have some Thorns application like Spiritborn and Barbarian has. And I would like some type of scaling for Thorns, stat-wise, outside of the Golem. And I had suggested this in the past, but, like, maybe when defenders taunt, they also get armor scaling or something. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much my outlook on this season and the Necromancer. And this has been such a long video. I know I covered a lot of things. I know there's a lot of things I didn't get to. I don't really want to go into my gripes about uniques. I hope that I share the same outlook that a lot of other people have. And I just wanted to say that I'm really appreciative to the devs for everything that they've done. This game has evolved from launch to now in an amazing way. And every season it is getting more complex, and there are more builds to play, and the play style for the skills is becoming more intriguing. Overall, thank you. Thank you. It has been a lot of fun, and I'm really enjoying this game. And I hope that we continue to get more updates and more cool things to play with. And I hope that this feedback helps let you guys know how I feel about the game as someone who's passionate about it. And I want to be clear that I have these harsh critiques because I do care about the outcome of this game. Diablo is one of my favorite franchises of all time. It beats out Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and everything else. I've read your books. I love this game. I'm deep into the lore. I want to see it succeed. I want to see where the story goes, and I want to defeat the Primevals. So, yeah. For everyone else, take care, and if you have any ideas or you don't agree with me, let me know. I'm very open-minded, and I think anytime that we're sharing information with each other, we're also changing the sentiment and the outlook and our suggestions for better things in the future. Anyways, this has been long enough. Take care, guys, and happy hunting.